If you passed Jeffrey Wallace on the sidewalk, you wouldn't look twice. Graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a slight limp in his left leg from an old construction accident. He waved at the mailman every morning. He tipped exactly 20% at the local diner. He lived in the same pale yellow house on Cherry Street for 31 years. When the detectives knocked on doors after the smell started drifting from the basement vents, every single neighbor used the exact same word. Quiet. He was so quiet. But the basement told a different story. And by the time the forensic team finished documenting what was down there, even the most seasoned homicide detectives in the state had to step outside and catch their breath. I want you to picture Maple Heights, Ohio. Population just under 23,000. The kind of town where kids still leave bicycles on the front lawn, where the high school football team decides the mood for the entire weekend. It's a place people move to when they want to escape the noise of the city. And on Cherry Street, specifically, it's the kind of block where neighbors borrow sugar and complain about property taxes. Jeffrey Wallace fit right in. He bought that pale yellow house back in 1994 with his wife, Linda. For a while, things seemed normal. Linda was spotted gardening. Jeffrey was out front mowing the lawn. But then, around 2008, Linda stopped appearing. Neighbors asked Jeffrey about her. He said she left him, said she packed a bag and went to live with her sister in Florida. People shrugged. It happens. Divorce is common. The neighborhood moved on, and Jeffrey became the quiet widower-type figure at the end of the block. Even though technically he wasn't a widower, just a man whose wife had supposedly left him without a goodbye party. Now, let's fast forward to the 15th of March 2024. A Wednesday, a plumber named Tony Rivas receives a frantic call from Jeffrey Wallace. Jeffrey's voice is calm, almost eerily so. But the message is urgent. There's a backup, a real bad one. The toilets won't flush. The sinks are gurgling. There's a stench, Jeffrey says, like something crawled into the pipes and died. Tony has been plumbing for 17 years. He's pulled everything out of residential pipes. He's found rats, raccoons, wedding rings, and once, a bag of diamonds. He figures this is just another dead animal situation. He pulls his van up to the pale yellow house at around 2 p.m. Jeffrey meets him at the door, smiling, offering a glass of iced tea. Tony declines. He just wants to get to work. He traces the blockage to the main sewer line that runs into the basement. Jeffrey tells him the basement door is at the end of the hallway. He says he doesn't go down there much anymore because his knees are bad. Tony nods. He walks down the hallway. The air gets heavier with every step. He opens the basement door, and that's when the smell hits him. Not the sharp, dead rat-in-the-wall smell he was expecting. This is a dense, suffocating, sweet-rotten odor. The kind you taste in the back of your throat. He flicks on the light switch at the top of the stairs. One bare bulb flickers on down below. The concrete floor is mostly dirt-covered. The foundation walls are damp. But Tony's eyes go straight to a section in the far corner of the basement, the fresh concrete. It's a patch, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, right over the main drain line. The concrete is a different color than the rest of the floor. Newer. And on top of that, patch sits a heavy wooden workbench that looks like it was dragged there recently. Jeffrey has placed a radio on that workbench, currently playing soft jazz from a local station. Tony walks down the stairs. His instincts are screaming. He steps closer to the new concrete patch. The floor around the edges isn't perfectly sealed. A dark, syrupy fluid has seeped out from a hairline crack and dried in a black puddle. He crouches down. He's seen grease clogs. He's seen sewage backups. This isn't that. He takes a screwdriver from his tool belt and kneels. His hand is shaking. He scrapes the edge of the crack. A piece of the concrete, poorly mixed and brittle, chips away. And from that small, dark opening, a swarm of bloated black flies that had been trapped underneath buzz out directly into his face. Tony stumbles backward, drops his screwdriver, and scrambles up the stairs. He doesn't tell Jeffrey. He mumbles something about needing a bigger snake from the truck. He walks straight out the front door, gets into his van, locks the doors, and calls 911. What happened next is the kind of slow, horrifying unraveling that these small towns never recover from. Police arrived within minutes. They secured the scene. They brought in a cadaver dog. The handler led the dog down into that basement. The dog immediately alerted at the edge of that fresh concrete patch, then laid down, whining, refusing to move. That is the universal sign. The handler looked at the officer standing at the top of the stairs and simply nodded. They'd need jackhammers. They'd need the coroner. The interrogation of Jeffrey Wallace began that evening. He sat in a small gray room at the Maple Heights police station, still wearing his slippers. Detective Maria Gonzalez sat across from him. She's been with the department for 22 years. She's broken men twice his size with just a look. But Jeffrey just smiled at her. He asked if this was about the plumbing issue. He offered to pay for the repairs. Detective Gonzalez slid a still photograph across the table. It was the new concrete floor in the basement. She asked him what was under it. Jeffrey tilted his head like a confused puppy and said, "Pipes, I guess?" He was impeccable. No nervous sweat, no trembling hands, no contradictions in his story. But the search warrant for the rest of the house had already been executed, and what the forensics team was finding upstairs was unraveling the script Jeffrey had been rehearsing for decades. In the upstairs hallway, there was a linen closet. Behind the stacks of old towels, detectives found a false wall. It was crudely cut drywall, just resting on the frame. No screws, no nails. Behind that drywall was a crawl space that led into the attic, a sort of secret vertical shaft. Inside that dark, narrow space, they found clear plastic bags. Inside the bags were women's clothes. Not one woman's clothes. Multiple sizes, multiple styles. Some looked decades old, floral patterns from the late 80s and early 90s. Some looked almost brand new. There were wallets and driver's licenses. The first one they pulled out belonged to a woman named Patricia Delaney. She was reported missing from a truck stop 15 miles away in 2003. She was a long-haul trucker who had pulled over to sleep and simply vanished. Her rig was still idling when the police found it. The second license belonged to a woman named Yvonne Marsh. She disappeared from a neighboring county in 2011. She was a real estate agent showing a vacant house. She never returned to her office. And the third license, still pristine, still showing the photo of a woman with kind eyes and short brown hair, was Linda Wallace, Jeffrey's wife, dated 2007. The police didn't have to wait for the concrete to be excavated to know they were standing in a house of horrors. It took the forensic team 2 days to carefully break through that 6x4 patch in the basement. They didn't use jackhammers. They used hand chisels. They treated it like an archaeological dig, because it wasn't just one body. The smell that Tony the plumber had identified wasn't decomposition in the singular sense. It was layers of it. As they chipped away, they found that Jeffrey hadn't just buried one person. He had laid down a body, poured a layer of concrete, waited years, and then done it again. The basement floor was a timeline of death. Linda was on the bottom. Her remains had almost completely skeletonized, merging with the concrete matrix. Above her, forensic anthropologists identified the remains of at least 2 other females, though they were so compressed and chemically altered by the lime and concrete mix that separating them took weeks. And right at the top, just inches below the surface, where Tony's screwdriver had poked through, was a body that was still disturbingly fresh. A young woman named Kelsey Orton, age 24. Reported missing just 4 weeks earlier from a Greyhound bus station 1 town over. Her case had barely hit the news cycle. When Detective Gonzalez confronted Jeffrey with the photograph of Kelsey Orton's driver's license, which they found not in the closet but in a locked metal box under his bed containing 7 licenses total, his polite, confused mask finally slipped. He didn't confess. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stopped smiling. He stared at the photo for 47 seconds of complete silence. Then he looked up at the detective and said, "I think I'd like to speak to a lawyer now." That was it. That was the moment the man who waved at the mailman, who tipped 20%, who was described by everyone as harmless and quiet, revealed the cold, calculated predator that had been hiding in plain sight. The pale yellow house is still there on Cherry Street. The grass is overgrown now. The windows are boarded up. But sometimes, neighbors still swear they can smell the faint, sweet rotten scent drifting from the vents on a hot summer day. And everyone who lives on that block learned a terrifying lesson in the months that followed. The most dangerous monsters don't howl in the night. They smile at you in the morning. They borrow your weed whacker. They tell you about their bad knees while their victims are sleeping under your feet. But the truly chilling part of this case isn't just the 7 confirmed driver's licenses. It's the 12 unmatched pieces of clothing found in that hidden attic shaft. 12. Which means the police in Maple Heights have identified 7 victims. But there are at least 5 more women who never came home, whose families are still waiting by the phone. And those bodies have never been found. Thank you for sticking with me through part 1 of this disturbing case. If you want to make sure you don't miss part 2, where we dig into the psychological profile of Jeffrey Wallace and the search for those 5 unidentified women, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. And I want to know what you think. Was Jeffrey a criminal mastermind? Or did the neighbors on Cherry Street simply see what they wanted to see? Let me know in the comments below. The defense attorney tried to paint Jeffrey Wallace as a frail old man with a bad knee and a heart condition. He shuffled into the courtroom in an oversized suit, leaning on a cane, his wire-rimmed glasses making him look more like a retired librarian than a serial predator. His lawyer argued that the man sitting before the jury was incapable of overpowering multiple women, some of them young and strong, some of them trained in self-defense. The courtroom murmured in agreement. It was hard to look at that gray-haired old man and see a monster. But then the prosecution stood up, walked toward the jury box, and played a single piece of evidence that shattered that image forever. It was a tape, a VHS tape, dusted off from a box in Jeffrey's attic, labeled in his own handwriting with 3 simple words: insurance videos, basement. The courtroom lights dimmed, the screen flickered, and what the jury saw on that tape made 3 people physically ill. 2 jurors broke down crying, and 1 alternate juror stood up and walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Because Jeffrey Wallace hadn't just murdered those women, he had documented everything. And the basement? The basement had even more secrets to reveal. When we left off in part 1, investigators had confirmed 7 victims through driver's licenses found in that hidden attic crawlspace. But the unmatched clothing told a darker story. 12 pieces. 7 confirmed identities. That math was terrifying. 5 unknown women. 5 families who had no idea their daughter, their sister, their mother had crossed paths with a monster on a quiet street in Maple Heights, Ohio. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in. They set up a task force. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic anthropologists. They didn't just tear up that basement floor. They tore up the backyard. They tore up the garden where Linda Wallace used to plant her tulips. They tore up the crawl space under the porch. And what they found rewired the way investigators think about suburban predators. The backyard was immaculate. Neighbors had always commented on Jeffrey's lawn. Perfect green stripes, manicured hedges, a vegetable garden in the back corner fenced off with chicken wire to keep the rabbits out. Jeffrey grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers. He would bring bags of them to the neighborhood block party every summer. People said his tomatoes were the best they had ever tasted. The soil, Jeffrey would tell them with a wink, was his little secret. When the forensic team ran ground-penetrating radar over that garden, the screen lit up like a Christmas tree. Anomalies everywhere, not rocks, not tree roots. The unmistakable shapes of human remains scattered throughout the soil, fragmented and broken into pieces. Jeffrey hadn't just buried bodies in his basement. He had turned his victims into fertilizer. The tomatoes that the whole neighborhood raved about had been growing in soil saturated with human decay. When that detail leaked to the press, 3 families on Cherry Street immediately checked into a hotel. One couple put their house on the market the next week. A woman named Brenda Collins, who had lived next door for 15 years and had eaten Jeffrey's tomatoes in her salads every single summer, gave an interview to a local news station where she just stared at the camera and vomited mid-sentence. But the tape was the real horror. The prosecution played it in open court, and although the judge cleared the gallery and sealed the footage from the public, the testimony from those who witnessed it paints a picture that I need to describe carefully. The tape was not a single recording. It was a compilation. Jeffrey had set up a camera in the basement, angled toward that concrete floor. But the footage wasn't of the act itself. It was something worse. It was the aftermath. The camera showed Jeffrey Wallace, calm and methodical, mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow, pouring it, smoothing it with a trowel. And as he worked, he talked, not to another person, to the camera, to himself, to the body underneath. The jury watched as Jeffrey patted the fresh concrete with his hand, like a gardener patting soil over a seed, and whispered, "There you go. Nice and quiet now, nice and quiet." On another segment of the tape, dated years later, Jeffrey looked directly into the lens. His face was calm, relaxed. He smiled and said, "Nobody ever checks the basement. People see what they want to see. They see a quiet man. They don't see the quiet work." He held up a pair of women's earrings, small gold hoops, and dangled them in front of the camera. Then he dropped them into the wet concrete and smoothed them over. Those earrings, the prosecution revealed, belonged to Patricia Delaney, the trucker who vanished in 2003. Her daughter, who was 8 years old when her mother disappeared, was sitting in the courtroom. She was now 29. She had spent her entire adult life not knowing what happened to her mother. And now she knew. Her mother's final resting place was a concrete floor in a pale yellow house in Maple Heights, buried under a workbench and a radio playing soft jazz. Detective Maria Gonzalez took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. She had been the one to break Jeffrey in the interrogation room, and her testimony was the moment the jury fully understood the depth of what they were dealing with. She read from a journal found in Jeffrey's nightstand. It wasn't a diary of confessions. It was a logbook. Dates, names, physical descriptions, hair color, eye color, approximate age, and a rating system. Jeffrey Wallace had rated his victims on a scale of 1 to 5. Categories included cooperation, noise level, and disposal ease. He wrote about these women like they were products to be reviewed, not human beings with families and dreams and futures. The coldest entry, the one that made Detective Gonzalez pause on the stand and take a breath before reading, was dated March 2nd, 2024, just weeks before the plumber found the blockage. It described Kelsey Orton, the 24-year-old who vanished from the Greyhound station. Jeffrey had written, Subject 4. Kelsey, noise level high. Disposal complicated by drain issues. Must repair pipes. Note to self, do not use the downstairs bathroom until resolved. He had written that note to himself, a reminder about plumbing, as if he was fixing a leaky faucet, as if the drain backup was an inconvenience, not the moment his decades-long killing spree finally collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts, 7 counts of first-degree murder, additional charges for abuse of a corpse, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. The judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Harmon, looked down at Jeffrey Wallace with an expression that combined disgust and something that looked almost like pity. Not pity for the man, pity for the families. Pity for a world where a person like this could walk among us for 31 years without anyone noticing. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 7 consecutive life sentences. She said, "Mr. Wallace, you called yourself quiet, but the silence you imposed on your victims will now be answered by a system that will never let you see the outside of a prison cell again." Jeffrey showed no emotion. He simply nodded, turned to his attorney, and asked if he could keep his glasses. But the story doesn't end with the sentencing, because the task force is still working. Those 12 unmatched pieces of clothing from the attic shaft have now been connected to 5 missing women from across 4 different states. Women who disappeared between 1998 and 2023. Women whose faces are now being shared on billboards and social media, their families holding on to the fragile hope that maybe, somehow, their loved one is one of the unidentified. The FBI has expanded the search. They're digging up the entire property, inch by inch. They're searching nearby wooded areas, abandoned lots, anywhere Jeffrey might have gone with his construction background and his access to heavy equipment. He worked as a contractor for 25 years. He poured foundations. He built basements. He knew concrete better than anyone. And investigators now believe that the bodies in that pale yellow house are only the beginning. There may be more. buried in the foundations of houses across Ohio. Houses where families are living right now, unaware of what's underneath their feet, sleeping above a darkness they can't see, hearing nothing but the hum of a furnace and the soft, distant echo of a monster's quiet work. And that is the true horror of Jeffrey Wallace. Not just what he did, but where he hid it. In plain sight, under a workbench, under a garden, under a neighborhood that called itself safe. He proved that evil doesn't need a dark alley or a remote cabin. It can live on Cherry Street. It can wave at the mailman. It can grow tomatoes. It can smile. It can be quiet. So quiet that you never hear the screaming. But the basement heard. The basement remembered. And now, finally, the basement has told its story. The question that lingers, the question that will haunt Maple Heights for generations, is simple. How many more basements are out there? How many more concrete floors are hiding the truth? And how many monsters are still sitting on their porches right now, nodding at their neighbors, watering their gardens, waiting for the next unsuspecting woman to walk down their street? Think about that tonight, when you lock your doors. Think about that when you wave at the quiet man on the corner. Because sometimes the quiet isn't peace. Sometimes the quiet is a grave. If this story shook you the way it shook me while writing it, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps more people hear these stories, and honestly, these victims deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. We're planning a follow-up episode on the 5 unidentified victims and the ongoing FBI search. Maybe your awareness, your tip, could help bring one of them home. And if you want to support this channel directly, check out the link in the description. Every bit helps us keep telling these stories with the care and depth they demand. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the scariest stories aren't the ones told around a campfire. They're the ones that happen 3 doors down, in the house you walk past every single day. I'll see you in the next one.